All right, and it's live. Welcome everybody to the February webinar, Racism as a Barrier to Recovery and Wellness. My name is Dwayne. I'm a person in long-term recovery, and what that means is that it's been 5 years since I felt to use any mind-altering drugs to change the way I feel. I speak out about recovery because somebody spoke out loud when I was silent and gave me the courage to speak up. And if I could just help one person, my job is done. So let's go over some housekeeping guidelines before I introduce our panelists. One, those who stay for the entirety of the training will get full credit for 1.5 CEUs. Two, you will not receive a certificate for the completion of this webinar, only a follow-up email from me or Larry thanking you for your participation. So make sure that you are keeping track so that you can submit your CEUs at the end of the year, either by creating a spreadsheet or a piece of paper with the month, the topic, and the panelists of the training you go to. Today's topic is racism as a barrier to recovery and wellness. The month is February, and the panelists are Rosalind Hayes and Chris Johnson. And you will be muted throughout the webinars. Please raise your hand if you have any questions or submit your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Last but not least, please make sure you have your name displayed in order to get full credit, not a phone number or an organization. And without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists who happen to be dual CPS certified, Rosalind Hayes and Chris Johnson.
Thank you, Dwayne. My name is Rosalind Hayes, and I too am a person in long-term recovery. Very excited to be here with you all this morning. What it means for me is that it's been over 12 years since my mental health concerns or addictive disease challenges have prevented me from living a full and productive life. Today, I am a daughter that my mother is proud of, and according to my nephews, I'm the coolest aunt ever. I am a homeowner, a taxpayer, and an active participant in my community. And I speak out loud today about recovery because I believe that everyone should know that recovery is an option and that recovery is a right, and that there shouldn't be anything to prevent us from pursuing, recovery to our fullest. And so I want to be a part of the change that, I want to see in lowering the barriers that folks face when trying to find recovery. And just to give a little context about our work today, on May 25th, 2020, the world watched George Floyd murdered at the hands of the Minnesota police. And, you all, it set off a powder keg across the country, and it was a summer of protest and social unrest. Just less than a month later, on June 12th, here in Atlanta, Rayshard Brooks was killed. And, the things just continue. The protests happened around the world. And as an organization, the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network, we got into conversation saying we have to address this somehow. We have to speak out. We have to address this somehow. And Chris and I, along with our director, Sherry Jenkins Tucker, do work with the Southeast Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, providing technical assistance regarding peer support for the Southeast region of the state. And, we talked about it and decided we had to have some conversations and get into the thick of it. And so out of that, we had a listening session with about 150 participants from across the country and asked some questions. And today we're going to ask you some of those same questions regarding race and recovery. As a result or a continuation of the work that we began with the listening session, we held a series of conversations about race and recovery. And so it's been a challenging and rewarding work that we've been doing. And we'll talk some more about that towards the end of our presentation. But now I'll hand it off to my colleague, Chris Johnson.
Thank you, Roz. My name is Chris Johnson. I am a person in long-term recovery. What that means for me is it's been a little over 11 years since my mental health or substance use concern prevented me from leading a full, productive, and rewarding life. Today, I am an active and contributing member of my family, my community, and my workplace. Today, I feed and walk my dog every day. And today, I take care of myself every day. And I talk out loud about my recovery because when I got well, I had access to lots of resources that allowed me to quickly and effectively remove my barriers to recovery. But when I went to work in Georgia's public behavioral health care system, I realized that many Georgians don't have access to those tools and resources. So I work today to help remove those barriers, to create those resources, and just to lift up the voice of mental health and substance use recovery in Georgia, because recovery is real and we are the evidence. So before we get started with our data piece, we are going to do a quick poll just to take the temperature of the room to see who is here. Dwayne, if you want to pop that up for us. So I am a peer providing peer support to people seeking or in recovery, a family member or close friend of a person entering recovery, a person who supervises peers who provide services to other people in or seeking recovery, a person who is primarily involved in administration or administration services, and 5, a person providing clinical services to people in or seeking recovery. At some point, I've been all of those things. Today, I'm just a panelist, right, Roz?
That's it.
Okay, so where are we, Dwayne? Did most folks vote? I see the poll went away, so hopefully that means poll results are coming. Nope.
We got 89% our peers providing support to people seeking or in recovery. And then the least amount would be a family member.
Okay. Awesome. Well, welcome to everyone. We are glad you're here, and we are most glad that there are this many people actively providing peer support in Georgia, because, you know, just 10 years ago, those numbers would have looked very different. So good for all of us, all of you doing that hard work. Before we move forward, just want to go over the learning objectives, right? We got to have learning objectives. So by the end of this training, I'd be able to describe how race impacts recovery supports in the community and the behavioral health system, discuss how race creates barriers to recovery and wellness, and identify immediate actions peer support providers can take to recognize and remedy barriers. So the information we're presenting here today was collected during an online listening session held Tuesday, September 15th of 2020. And for those of you who have been through CARES training, I'm CARES 15, obviously that's CARES. That CARES 9 likes to talk a lot of stuff, but we all know it's not real. Right? CARES 9.
8.
So one of the reasons we foundationally want to get and understand, because many of us who've done this work have heard or witnessed things that felt or seemed or were blatantly racist, and we wanted to get an idea of how common those things were, because what we learned over the summer, many of us for the first time, some of us just got a refresher when we saw a lot of that sort of violent video, is that, you know, it's not just the idea of racism that is a barrier to recovery and wellness. It's, you know, the brutalization of Black bodies that we saw, you know, that creates a barrier to recovery and wellness. Because as we know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, if we don't feel safe, like if our bodies don't feel safe, it's going to be very difficult for us to achieve those higher levels of emotional, psychological well-being, right? So we wanted to get a sense through the listening session back last September of, how safe do people feel in these spaces? So with that, I am going to turn over the first poll question to Rosalind. Ros?
All right, thank you. So you all see the question here. How much do you believe racism impacts the ability of peers to receive the support they need? Not at all, a little, somewhat, a great deal. You can go ahead and register your responses.
Dwayne, can we get that music from, what is it, Jeopardy? That would be awesome.
All right. And so we see the results here, 64%, great deal, 30% somewhat, 5% a little, and 0. No one said that it is not a barrier or does not impact. And so going on to look at the results that we got when we did our listening session in the summer, you can see that the results are very much the same. 66% of the folks responded a great deal. And like you all, nobody said that racism did not impact the ability of peers to receive the supports they need at all. So the majority fall with somewhat and a great deal. And just, this coming out the gate with our first poll, your responses are consistent with the responses that we got, and probably consistent with what people, if we did this kind of polling any place in this country, the results would probably look very much the same. And we can see that racism is a huge factor, or people believe racism is a great factor in impacting folks' ability to receive the support they need.
Okay, going on to the next poll question, we're getting a little more specific here. And this is on a scale from 1 to 7, how present is racism in the behavioral health treatment delivery system, right? And it goes from, number 1, not present at all, to number 7, entirely present. Roz, you can sing a little tune for us, right? You can sing. You got a voice. Use your voice.
I don't know how good it is.
Okay, so we see here not present at all. We have one person who said that. Then we move on to somewhat present. That's about 18% of you. The highest was 34%, right there between somewhat present and entirely present. And then 12 and 15 up there, looking at the more present. And that is somewhat consistent with what we saw last September when we started putting this information together. There was no one in our previous data gathering session that said it was not present, but most everyone felt like it was, as you can see here, from the yellow number 4 to the sort of lilac number 7, that most people believe that it's present, and present to a great degree. Because even if you only believe it's somewhat present, it's still there. So we are, and that was just about the behavioral health system itself. Now, Roz is going to talk to you about community support.
Yeah, so thinking about community support, 12, whatever kinds of mutual support meetings that you might attend, or, you know, church or housing, anything, all of those things that we need to support our recovery that's outside of the actual behavioral health system. On a scale of 1 to 7, how present is racism in community supports outside of the behavioral health treatment delivery system? And again, 1 is not present, 1 is not present, and 7 is
entirely present.
Entirely present. Yes.
Entirely present. It says
yes.
Not at all present, but it should say entirely present. And that was
present.
a mistake on the slide. Yeah.
Not present to entirely present. So again, please register your responses.
Who did these slides, Roz? Just fire that joker.
Oh, look at here.
Nice.
All right. And so we see we have a range here starting, like, no one says that it's not present at all. So everyone to this question acknowledges that there is some racism occurring in the community supports. The greatest number, we're pretty close there, with somewhat present at 4 with 30%, and then number 5, 32%, taking it up a little bit. And then 6 and 7, again, you know, moving towards entirely present. We have like 36% of folks between 6 and 7. And so again, you know, it points to that we all see that there's a problem. And if we compare it to the data that we gathered when we did our initial listening session, what we see is, next slide, Dwayne, please.
It's actually me, sorry, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dwayne. We see that, you know, same thing here. Everyone acknowledged that it was present. And really, in this setting, again, folks came in, they started to register around a 3, moving towards entirely present. And, you know, again, you see the majority of the folks fell down in 6 and 7, with that's what, 63% of the respondents saying that it was pretty much entirely present. And so again, our data is lining up with what you all have experienced and, you know, what the broader demographic experience.
All right, so before we go into the next question, I just want to acknowledge to Kayla, who says in the chat that Forsyth County has an ugly history of racism. I think it'd be hard pressed to find any Georgia county that doesn't have some history of ugly history of racism. You know, it might be more present, more violent, you know, whatever, but, you know, it, as a native Georgian, love my state, but, you know, we got a history and it is not all pretty. So next poll question is, how many times have you witnessed overt or implied racism within the behavioral health system or your workplace? Right. A, never. B, 1 to 10 times. C, 10 to 50 times. D, more times than I can count. Okay, so we have our results here. A, never. B, 1 to 10 times. C, 10 to 50 times. And D, more times than I can count. And honestly, these line almost exactly with our findings from the CPS community at large, you know, with a small percentage saying never, and a larger percent saying, you know, somewhere like 1 to 10 times, 10 to 50 times, and a few more times than I can count. And, you know, we wished in the end that we'd had the opportunity to dig in a little more deeply with this data, because with the more times than I can count, you know, if you work with one person who is incredibly racist and making, you know, racist comments frequently, you know, it can be within a month that that one person makes it more times than you can count. So, you know, understanding what those times look like, you know, is it persistent through the organization? Is it one person, you know, and unfortunately we weren't able to do that. But, you know, I think this, you know, this direct observation, this direct witnessing of racism, I think, you know, speaks to, you know, it really, its presence is there. So, and we are a witness to it, right? As certified peer specialists, right? So, you know, as we move forward talking about what our roles are in this conversation, like, you know, we are witnesses to it, and we as certified peer specialists, addictive disease or CARES, you know, it's part of our role to advocate. So what does that look like? Roz, you're going to say something?
I just, this question too, talking about wishing we could dig into it a little more, like where folks say, you know, like the never, or, you know, the lower end of that, it just, for me, begs the question of, like, if something is a norm in within an organization, and this is our way that we always do it, then would I even recognize it as implied racism? You know, I might not, it might not even register for me that what I'm witnessing or our way of doing business is, you know, is racist. And so it is a very interesting question that, you know, if we could dig into a little deeper, it would be probably really revealing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Roz.
All right, we have another poll question. Do people of color feel equally welcomed in your behavioral health system or workplace? And again, this is another one of those questions, but if you will, we have number 1, not at all, number 2, a little, number 3, somewhat, and 4, absolutely. And so if you will go ahead and respond, we'll see how it works out. All right, so we see 7% of folks said not at all. 21% said people of color feel a little welcome, 35% somewhat welcome, and 37% said absolutely welcome. And if we look at our results, we can see that they pretty much, again, mirror. It's very interesting. I think the absolute number and the somewhat number were kind of reversed, where 37% of you all said that people of color absolutely feel equally welcome, and then 27% was somewhat, but still see that, you know, I mean, this is leaning in that direction of things, you know, or people feel kind of welcome. You know, it's over 50% with somewhat or absolutely, but it still speaks to a problem. And again, it you know, how do I know that people of color feel equally welcomed in my behavioral health system? You know, so it's another one of those questions that we wish we could do a little bit of a deeper dive with.
Right, and I feel the same way about my CARES that I felt about the people who responded before. It's like, okay, you just told us that there's all this overt and implied racism in your organization, but now you're telling me that people of color feel equally welcomed in your behavioral health system, and those things, that does not connect for me in my mind. You know, so I think people here, like with this question, and it may have something to do with the way we worded the question, but it's like, I welcome people in the behavioral health system, but that does not mean people of color feel equally welcome. And I think a great way to find out is for organizations to start asking. Right? It's like, you know, it's right there. I mean, this is one of those things that, you know, if it matters to you, you can ask, you can find out. So
Riley says, personally, I believe that in order to answer these questions honestly, we have to have a good understanding as to what not only racism is, but what systemic racism is and how it manifests itself while living in a culture dominated by white supremacy.
yeah, we actually had a conversation about that with our colleagues at Emory, going into these conversations, and for us trying to create a definition of and assign a definition and say this is it. We just decided to let people's own understanding of what racism is inform these conversations, because people have lots of different ideas about what it is, how it is, and we didn't want to assign our definition to others. If that makes sense to y'all, like, because then, you know, if I say racism is this,
right,
it makes the gathering of this data a little harder. And this is really soft data. This is, you know, very qualitative understanding of, you know, what's happening out there. So it's, but I appreciate the question, Riley, sorry, and the comment, and I don't disagree with you, but, you know, coming to that common understanding of what racism is a whole separate webinar probably. So we are going to move on to the next poll question. Y'all, we only got a couple more poll questions, we promise, but we love questions. We love it. We're not as bad as George, right?
All right.
But
our next question: as a certified peer specialist, how empowered do you feel in your workplace to address racism? Number one, not empowered at all. Number two, a little empowered. Three, somewhat empowered. Four, fully empowered. Five, depends on the circumstances. All right. So, Chris, I see I jumped on your slide. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I share. My mama taught me how to share.
So looking at the results, we see, and this is such an interesting question. Not at all empowered, 7%, a little empowered, 13%, somewhat empowered, 19%, fully empowered, 31%, and depends on the circumstances, has a slight nudge, but is the received the most responses at 33%. And so let's see what we got. Same, look at that, 33%, depends on the circumstances. Folks generally seems that folks had generally felt somewhat empowered at a higher rate than you all did, but still the responses are pretty much the same. And this is another one of those questions, you know, where we want to have some conversation about, you know, because we think about protecting the check. We think about, you know, what will happen to me if I speak out? Will anything change if I speak out? All these different things play into, I believe, depends on the circumstance. You know, what kind of relationship do I really have with my boss? And so this is one of those really tricky questions, and it shouldn't be. We should feel free and this speaks to something in and of itself. This speaks to the systemic nature of racism in and of itself when we feel uncertain or unsure about being able to have certain conversations. So very interesting.
So Rosalind, we have a peer in the Q&A tab that says, how does this relate to the LGBTQ community?
I would say that when we're talking about discrimination, there is an intersect. You know, there's an overlap and an intersect, and we could switch these questions and ask, you know, how empowered do you feel in your workplace to address LGBTQ discrimination, and see, you know, how those responses come up. And so I think that when we're talking about today we're just talking about a specific type of discrimination, but I think these things, you know, need to be addressed on all levels, and just recognizing that intersect of power, privilege, and discrimination on the flip side. Chris, you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think there's definitely some intersectionality, but, you know, the myths and stigmas of being a Black person in America and the myths and stigmas of being an LGBTQ person in America different. And I think you know, especially like, you know, the myth of the, you know, violent Black man or the angry Black woman that we heard a lot about when we were doing these sessions over, you know, the winter months, you know, those don't exist in the LGBT. I mean, there are definitely like other myths that do exist that do impact the ability to receive equitable care for those populations. But I think, you know, our focus very specifically on this, because I mean, I think, you know, the disparity you see in treatment and support in society overall, like, you know, that's what we saw playing out last summer. You know, there's just a different level of really just, you know, disregard for folks and their needs and their participation in the community. We are going, intersectionality, sorry. For those who don't know, intersectionality is just where things overlap, right? Where there's an intersection between ideas or concept, populations. Like I am an example, as is Roz, of the intersectionality of certified peer specialist AD and certified peer specialist mental health, right? We are, because we have both of those credentials, we are able to demonstrate the intersectionality of co-occurring recovery stuff. Right? We got to come. All right, so moving on to what I am pretty sure is our final poll question. And it's sort of a complicated one, but just so you all know, you can choose all of the responses that apply, right? So how has your organization responded to recent social unrest surrounding racial injustice? And the options are: my organization has done nothing. My organization has provided internal or external communication. My organization is in the process of gathering information, providing communication, but has not made meaningful change. My organization is in the process of gathering information, making meaningful change. My organization has thoughtfully responded and made meaningful changes. And finally, my organization has thoughtfully responded and made impactful changes and is in the process of continuing to gather information. And this is actually Roz's question. We're horrible dance partners. We jump on each other's toes. Roz, you want to take it?
You can go ahead with it.
Okay. So looks like for about a quarter of you, my organization has done nothing. Then about 30% of you in my organization has provided internal, external communication, 30% as the majority. And for the rest of you, your organization are in the process of trying to figure some of this out. And, you know, first we will look at how that compares with our other poll. And it's again about the same. The reality is, for me, as someone who has worked in the private sector, someone who's worked in higher education, someone who's worked in behavioral health services, for me it is disturbing, truly disturbing, that organizations like, you know, furniture manufacturers, you know, people who sell hamburgers, have done more within their organizations to begin looking at understanding and correcting racism within their workplaces and creating social justice than behavioral health care providers. It is just, you know, we think of ourselves, or at least I think of us, I think of certified peer specialists as humanitarians. I think of us as doing good work. And it breaks my heart personally that, you know, McDonald's is doing more in some hospitals and behavioral health providers to create equity in our systems, because we've seen from this poll here today from you all that racism does exist in these systems, right? And yet, you know, over 20% of you said your organizations have done nothing. And that's not okay. I guess I'm not supposed to be judging here. That's not part of my role here today. But Roz, can I say that's not okay?
Yeah, it's not okay.
Okay, thanks, Roz.
Yeah.
We're all peers here together, so I'll just say that's not Vegas rules. That's not okay. But yeah, Roz, do you have anything you want to tack on there?
No, I'm looking forward to getting into some of the anecdotal responses that we got.
Okay, so just before we go on, we want to let you know that the notes that we're about to share with you, these were transcribed from the breakout groups that we facilitated during the big listening session. We got over 150 responses to 4 questions. And, you know, the responses that we're showing here, you know, they represent the most common themes. A couple of them were included because they just really stood out as, whoa, this happened. So we will share those with you, but we will identify those as we share them. Okay, Roz?
Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry. It's on my screen.
All right. And so when we ask the question, what racial barriers to recovery and wellness exist in your organization? Some of the responses here are, you know, organizations don't understand the daily struggle of being a person of color. And like Chris said, some of these were picked because they represent a theme, and others because they were just really singular and pop out. Here, the next response, this person was at a statewide nonprofit, and a Black person said she wanted to open a center and was told, you know, that's very expensive, and, you know, got complimented on how well she read. And, you know, they knew nothing about her education and what kind of money she has. And so this just speaks to those kinds of assumptions that, you know, that are prevalent, and kind of to microaggressions, to the assumptions, or you couldn't possibly afford a center, even though I know nothing about you. And, oh, wow, by the way, you read so well. You know, just it's a shock that a person of color would be articulate. And these kind of comments, or these are things where that question talked about when we say, well, how would a person, would you recognize this as racism? Would you recognize saying to a person of color, oh, you read so well, as something that has racist undertones? This next one, I work in mental health and drug court, and one of the individuals that I serve showed me a picture of himself dressed in the robes, the KKK robes, and makes racist comments. My organization says that we have to meet people where they are, and I try to do this, but it's hard. I told him that we would have to disagree on this issue. I find that I do not want to help him as much as others because he's such a racist. And of course, this is one of those ones that really stood out. It's not every day that someone, comes, that you're providing support for, comes and, shares a picture of themselves, in Klan robes or something similar. And so just, you can just see how distressing this would be. And then how do we address it, and for this person just to be told, well, we got to meet people where they are, maybe there could have been more that was said, or more support for the individual, recognizing how distressing, this would be for a person of color, particularly. The next one again talks about, leadership at my organization does not reflect the population of the staff. And so that sharing of power and people of color being in leadership roles isn't there. The agency has a doctor that deals completely different with people of color than they do with Caucasians. Most of the time it's quite obvious. We know about, the disparities in healthcare, disparities in mental health care, disparities in diagnosing of more serious disorders, going to, say, Black men being disproportionately diagnosed with schizophrenia, for example. And so we know that these things are something that, runs throughout the behavioral health system in this country.
Thanks, Roz. I just also point out, I was in the breakout room with CPS, who was talking about being shown a picture of Peer in clam robes on the courthouse steps. And the thing that was most shocking to me about that was that, just the casual way in which the person described it being done. Like there was an assumption that this was okay, that this was a shared experience among, middle-aged white men in this community. And it was, again, speaks to the larger challenges we face in our, communities in Georgia, in understanding who our neighbors are, understanding how we can work to create equity in Georgia. Moving on to the next question was, what racial barriers to recovery and wellness exist in your community? Racial barriers in housing was a big one. And again, this goes back to that Maslow's hierarchy of need. Like you need a safe place to stay, to live, to be, to grow, to get well, and stay well. People find it difficult to find decent housing, and the agency does not address this as it should. Fear of interfacing with police in the community, and I think that it's a consistent theme. Honestly, I don't like interfacing with the police at all. None. So and there aren't even, pictures on TV of people who look like me, experiencing the kind of violence that, Black people experience. DFACS show blatant racism. That is, DFACS was called out a few times. And again, this listening session was from the Southeast. It was the 7 states of the Southeast, so that it wasn't just Georgia. So just made that clear. But when we think about what sort of training people receive, what sort of educational background, what the expectations of different roles are, and what support people receive in, providing good, equitable support and services to their community. We don't know, but we did hear a lot about people experiencing racism when they went to, access supports to get and stay well. I have heard from Black peers that ministers and family members told them that they were not praying hard enough or else they would not have mental health issues. Again, this was a pretty common theme that, many people felt like they were not supported in Black churches with their mental health needs, and, were told they weren't praying hard enough, weren't going to church enough, weren't, there was, this stigma around mental health was being perpetuated within the Black church. Now, we've learned since that we know there are some Black churches that do a great job of supporting people with mental health needs and connecting them with, resources, support, help, but still not as much as we would like. So that is definitely something that needs some work. And down here, there are not enough people of color in mutual support groups. I can tell you for sure, when I was living in South Georgia in, a community that was, had a very large Black population in most of the 12-step and other meetings that I went to, people of color were highly underrepresented. There might be one or two people who, either had long-term recovery and showed up, or were sent there by drug court and, would stay for as long as they were required to. But in terms of active participation in the recovery community, there was not representation of people of color. And so moving on to, sorry, give me just a second here. Okay, so Roz, apparently I'm talking for a long time here, so jump in here because people get tired of hearing my voice, so help me out here. Do you want to do this one?
Yeah,
on the next one too.
Yeah, okay. I'll take this one. And just thinking about where you talked about the mutual support groups and churches, you actually made the comment that just rings so true, that the church hour on Sunday is like one of the most segregated times in the country. And, I noticed, of course there are churches that are multicultural, but there still is a thing about folks going to worship with folks that look like themselves. And, that same kind of feeling, my experience, here in Georgia is, with mutual support groups is that same type of thing. Depending on what side of town you're on, you can find mutual support groups that are all Black, or just, with just a very few others in the mix. And then the same thing is true, go to another side of town. And maybe that just has to do with where people live, but then that still speaks to the systemic racism and in housing and, where people live, there and where they don't live. And so it's just a very interesting thing. Looking at the question in front of us, what experiences of racism have you encountered in your behavioral health system? Excuses are made not to provide services to many people of color. I've seen people of color giving excuses as to why they were not seen in a timely manner or why they can't get answers to some of their questions. It's as though they don't exist, or how dare you question someone in authority. And the next one says, Black peers talk about how they are afraid of the police and are treated poorly by the police. And white peers say, you're delusional, it's not true, y'all are making that up. And again, these are people's individual experiences. And so it's not to lay out these sweeping generalities on anyone. But, these are things that come up for people. And these are the experiences that people have, thinking about the police. I heard Chris say he doesn't like to deal with the police. Especially during the summer, I used to pray every day when I left the house, Lord, don't let me have any kind of encounter with the police today. Just because I was afraid of how it could end up. I know I have a mouth and, just being able to sit on my tongue in that kind of an encounter would be really difficult for me. And so I literally would pray, don't let this happen. We had an incident over the summer where a peer came to the Peer Support Wellness and Respite Center, and she came in the middle of the night. She was knocking on the door. She wanted to come in. Of course, she couldn't come in at that time of night. She was no longer a respite guest. And I got a call at like 3 o'clock in the morning. She's here and she's knocking on the door. And, what should I do? And my question was, is she disturbing the neighborhood? No, she's not disturbing the neighborhood. And so my direction was to do nothing. Just let her stay there. And the reason that I said do nothing was because I was afraid that if the police came, she might not make it out alive. Literally, that was my consideration. What will happen to this woman who's experiencing, obviously experiencing mental health challenges, if the police are called at 3 a.m. to deal with her? And so, I said, leave her alone. Just let her stay. And eventually she left, and she left without incident. And so those are the kinds of things. And it's unfortunate that we really have to give, should I call the police? What'll happen if the police come? And so that we have to live with that kind of thinking, and that we always have to consider those things before we can respond or react is, again, speaks to the problems with the system. So Chris, we can go on from there.
Vanessa has a question if she would be allowed to talk. Is that fine?
Okay.
Vanessa, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Come on, Vanessa. There you go.
Hello.
We can
Go ahead, Vanessa.
Oh, I didn't have anything to say. I must have raised my hand by mistake.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Vanessa.
All right.
All right, so going on to the next slide, just a couple more examples of racism in the behavioral health care system. One peer shared, I was working in a hospital. A Hispanic woman was brought in by emergency. The emergency staff said, "You don't even belong here." Then staff were cussing and saying terrible things to her without asking if she spoke English. Came to realize that she did speak English, and it broke my heart that she understood the names they were calling her. They were also poking at her head. It makes me sick even now to talk about this incident. And I worked at a community service provider where peers were coming out of jail. People of color were sent back to jail at a much greater rate than whites for the same behaviors. When I asked about this, the person in charge sending them back to jail said that she was following the director's orders and that she needed to keep her job. She was a Black lady, and she said that she felt badly every time she sent someone back. I left that job as soon as I could, and so did she. And Kareem, I think getting back to your question that you had above about administration, and I think some other people, some comments, I don't know, honestly, that there's as much of a disconnect between, Black administrators and the folks providing services around, as much as there is a, sense of fear of retaliation in trying to change a system that, you know, has been in place for a long time. Depending on where you are, you know, that's certainly going to change. But, you know, there are few workplace environments where stirring up stuff, you know, if that's how it's perceived, is a good career choice, right? It's like, you know, being an advocate, you know, can come with risk in the workplace. So it's a challenge. You know, I don't think there are black and white answers for most of this stuff, except for, you know, that you know, nice Hispanic woman in the emergency room. The lack of culturally and linguistically appropriate services and supports for folks in Georgia, you know, has got to change. You know, we still rate 51st in access to behavioral health services in the country. We're behind the District of Columbia. We're behind Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina. And usually one of them is worse than us at something, right? But when it comes to access to behavioral health services, we are dead last. And when you look at linguistically and culturally appropriate services and supports, you know, we're still right there. Because if you can't get any services, you can't get linguistically and culturally appropriate services, right? So it's really challenging. Roz, how do you feel about that administration question, that leadership question that Kareem brought up? Because that's something we specifically asked about. But I know, you know, DBHDD has some great people of color in great leadership positions. And you know, and I know from working with them that, you know, some of them came, like, you know, from providing direct support, and they're deeply connected to their communities, to their neighborhoods, and, you know, do understand. So how do you feel about that?
I think that Atlanta, being just the population of Atlanta, the demographics of Atlanta being what they are, you know, we are well represented at the department. And, you know, I think that, you know, as we span out and get into smaller organizations, that is not the case. And I think that because this is a topic that is just, you know, so much emotion around, and it's just such a charged topic, that even as we push for equity, and even as we raise these kinds of questions, I think that people, you know, are always kind of like on a thin line, you know, because there is still that, you know, how much can I say? What's going to be too much? You know, when might I be retaliated against? You know, and so it's difficult. Again, I think that in Georgia, you know, we do have, or, you know, here in Atlanta, because DBHDD is in Atlanta, then we do have, you know, a great deal of representation. I don't know if we've ever had a commissioner of color, or you know, in any of those positions, but it's just, you know, you talked about dancing, and it's just because we don't have these conversations, and because, like someone said in the chat, you know, they said, well, you know, I'm afraid to say anything, and I have to assume that this person is a white person. They said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically, I'm afraid to say anything because if I don't say it right, if I use the wrong language or whatever, then, you know, folks are going to be mad at me. And so just the fear around how to have these conversations, and how much can we really push this issue, and still have a job to go to. We can look at our current political climate. Just look at our political climate here in Georgia, and, you know, thinking about folks who are just pushing for voter rights and things like that, and they get death threats, you know. And so it is a really huge thing in this country, and figuring out how we can have these conversations without retaliation is something, you know, and getting folks on board with us is something that will just be a continual thing, just as it has been in this country forever. You know, thinking about civil rights movement and just all of that, we've been at this for some progress, but there's still lots of progress to be made. All right, so looking at this next question, how does your organization respond to experiences of racism? Very interesting. So first one said, my organization responded with an email, Black Lives Matter and Equity Matters. But when asked by Blacks in the organization if they would change a Confederate holiday to another holiday, management said they'd have to take that up with the legislator. So here we go. It's a prime example of, you know, we can talk about it, but then when the rubber meets the road and it's time for things to change, are we actually able to affect change? And are we in positions as people of color to be able to affect change? The next response, our organization was afraid to put out any communication about Black Lives Matter until after the legislative session was over, because we were afraid that if some legislators associated us with Black Lives Matter, they would cut more funding to our program. So the politics of this all is all, you know, woven together, and folks are afraid at organizational levels to, you know, express maybe what they truly believed, you know, because they feared their money would get cut. And so, you know, we were talking about the systemic nature of this, and just this, the responses to this question really speak to how these things are all woven together, and how people, you know, won't, you know, a lot of times because of sacrifice, you know, if to be an activist, to be a true advocate, there is, you know, risk with that and in that. And so this organization wanted to hold back. The final response that we have says, when racial injustices occur, nothing is said or done. It is just swept under the rug. I've seen so many of my coworkers promoted that don't have the qualifications that I have, time and time again. It's very disheartening. It's a very disheartening feeling that you don't have the support of the administration. At some point, this is going to have to be dealt with. It's very demoralizing. So again, we can just feel the charge. We can see the political and systemic implications throughout these answers.
Karim has his hand up. Let me see if I could get him to. There you go.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I want to say first, thanks for this webinar. It's very enlightening and I think very much needed. But something that just came to mind, in addition to what I wrote previously, you know, it's real difficult when you work for an organization where the people that are being served are predominantly people of color or African American. And we think about the treatment services that we provide, how they're not culturally directed to those people. And you know, you said something that really touched the nerve with me, Roz, when you talked about that fear that's involved with speaking on something because you don't know how it might be received or if you will be retaliated against. And you know, when we know, those of us that have been doing this work for as long as we have, decades, when we know that there are programs or treatment services geared towards people of color that specifically target those areas in which they struggle, substance use, yeah, all of us, black, white, brown, whatever, can struggle with that. But the underlying issues that are that are the causes and conditions of the substance use and how those are actually addressed and how those can be resolved for the people we serve, when we know that there are programs out here for those individuals that we can give them and serve them with, and we're not. We have to use this cookie cutter treatment service that is used in Fulton County to Forsyth County. And that's really a struggle when you make mention of it, ask for it, and then you're put on hold or you're told, hurry up and wait for it or something to that effect. And that's not so much demoralizing, but extremely frustrating. Extremely frustrating. And it makes one want to do something different sometimes. You know, if not for the passion that we have for this work and wanting to see people get better. But it's real difficult when you know that there are ways in which we can help people, that if we were given the opportunity to present to them, they would greatly more, they would benefit more from what we do already, from what we've been doing for the last 20 years. I just needed to say that.
Thank you, Corinne.
Raj, you want me to take this one?
Sure.
Okay. This is again, how does your organization respond to experiences of racism? I know of several incidences of racism that were reported, and none of them got any further than the initial report. This has happened time after time. So most times people have at least stopped reporting incidences because we all know nothing will happen. People of color do not have the support of the administration. This is really sad, but it speaks to the state of affairs in the country. People seem to not want to confront the issue of racism, which is best left untouched. Yeah, I know that has been the case in many systems that I've worked in, including higher education, right? People like, there's this, and I think part of it has to do with like this fear of litigation. Like, if we admit racism happens here, are we going to get sued, right? So we can't admit it, but we can, like, you know, send out an email that says we support this stuff, right? So it's creating systemic change requires acknowledging something needs to be changed, and many organizations just aren't willing to do that. Fortunately, ours is. Me and Ron, when we started this work, and we'll talk about this a little more later, but the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network, you know, over the summer began and, you know, is continuing to have these really challenging conversations. So we'll talk about that a little more. Diversity Committee meets weekly. They have discussions on how to improve. If there's a peer that wants to link up to someone on the committee, they can set that up for the peer so the peer can feel heard, which is amazing, right? At RISE, she has a space where people can create. It was essential that they could create using those feelings and express them in safe places. They started a creative protest where they could pick creations and have a voice there at Emory. I think we are all amazed by Alexia's work, or at least I am. And if you're not, I will judge you and say you should be. Apparently, I'm in a judgy mood this morning. Sorry about that. Organization responded to a vendor who displayed racism by not continuing to do business with the vendor. You know, and those are, you know, good steps. You know, making incremental steps is better than doing nothing. You know, having a diversity committee is, you know, better than not having a diversity committee. You know, having, you know, creating change by, if you can move your dollars away from places that are promoting or supporting or perpetuating racism, you know, that's good. Right. So understanding who your vendors are, I think, is an important thing for all of us doing this work. Roz, you have anything you want to add there?
No, I think you covered it all. Thank you.
Okay. All right, then moving on.
All right. So what changes need to be made to remove racism as a barrier to recovery in your behavioral health system? This is the hard part that we found, or the challenge is, you know, how do we fix this, you know? And so, you know, we have to first acknowledge there's a problem. We have to be honest about the events that have happened and those that continue to happen. We need to have diversity training on an ongoing basis. We cannot continue to ignore racism. It's killing our people, and it has to end. An advisory council made up of peers who have used the services for their feedback. First thing would be for acknowledgement and openness about racism. There's no discussion, so there's no change. There's good literature to read, but we have to meet people where they are. Most do not understand white privilege. Training's very important. And again, all of these are wonderful steps and are things that we should do. And changing hearts and minds and changing culture, changing what people really truly believe is a difficult thing. And I don't know if changing what a person believes is necessary. We want to change what they do. And usually those things go hand in hand, but if workplaces had certain standards in place and held people accountable, then no matter what you believed, you would do what was required or be more likely to do what was required. And so getting into the solution of this is a huge undertaking, but it begins with all of these different kinds of things that are being discussed right now. And I will say this, within our organization, like Chris just said it, we have we have had some conversations because it was brought to our attention, like, how can you be doing this work and not be taking a look at yourselves? And so it's like, wow, that's legit, And so we started having those conversations, and it's been almost painful sometimes, but in a good way, because people have really had to sit and been willing to sit in their discomfort and risk not using the correct language, and risk people kind of looking at them sideways, but having that willingness to be authentic and to be transparent and just to bring their truth. And it's so interesting is because what you find is that people so often they're not interested in doing harm to someone else. It's people have learned these things, and this stuff just becomes ingrained in who we are. And if learning can happen, unlearning can happen as well. And we can continue to make steps and strides towards undoing some of this and changing the system.
Okay, so finishing up with what changes need to be made to remove racism as a barrier to recovery in your community. Again, we have to first acknowledge there is a problem. There were communities in Georgia last summer who, their problems were put on international TV, right? They're countries that don't even know where Atlanta is, but they know Georgia has a problem with racism, right? We saw it live in real time. Economic changes need to happen for more opportunities and options. And again, that goes back to that, removing barriers to wellness and recovery, right? And just like, we all need a safe place to lay our heads down at night. We all need to know where our meal is coming from, right? Creating economic opportunity and real economic opportunity is something that has to happen. We need to step in when we see or need to respond. Again, it's true, but it's easier said than done, right? For the reasons we were just talking about, listening session, town hall meetings, communication, absolutely we need, to continue this dialogue, because, racism as a barrier to recovery and wellness, and racism generally, is not going to be fixed there. It's not going to be fixed next year, right? This is, Rob said, we've been talking about it for a long time and we've made some progress. We got a ways to go, right? We definitely just have a ways to go. And, with that listening and understanding piece, we want to, because we're sort of coming up on time here, before we get too far away from the results, we do want to tip, for those of you who aren't familiar with the 21-day challenge, it is a tool that was developed by Dr. Eddie Moore. His 21-day racial equity habit building challenge, encourages us to explore how we know what we know, right? We get our information about others from, right? How do we develop that understanding, and how do we unlearn that? You know, on the mental health side, you know, same, you know, the reason we do our recovery messaging the way we do it, right, is because the media perpetuates these ideas and creates stigma that we have to undo. But really learning, understanding how our ideas around race have been shaped is really important. So we encourage you to go to the gmhcn.org website. On the page, there's a link to the 21-day challenge. And you can go, and a lot of it's fun. A lot of it's fun. Me and Roz spend time coming up stuff. There's lots of music, some reading, some essays that really, they made me think, and that takes a surprising lot. Also, we told you we were going to talk to you about solutions. We believe that there are solutions in every community. I mean, for me, as a certified peer specialist in mental health, as a certified peer specialist, addictive disease, if I live in a community where there are 12-step meetings that are mostly attended by people of color and 12-step meetings that are mostly attended by people who are white, there is a barrier there, right? There just is, right? You know, figuring out what it is important. So there are opportunities for all of us in our places of work, in our recovery community organization. I can tell you, when I was the coordinator at the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse for the recovery community organizations, in some communities, connecting with the Black population of some communities where folks have been invited to participate in stuff I don't know for years was so hard. Like, creating those connections within communities was just a real challenge because of, you know, the racism that, you know, people were talking about earlier in the chat. It was just a real challenge. But I can tell you one thing that we're excited about in at the Mental Health Consumer Network is there was recently a grant opportunity that came up from SAMHSA and the Georgia Mental Health Consumer Network in Fulton County, put forward a grant proposal. But even if we don't get the grant proposal, a lot of community support for something called the Spot. And that, you know, it was really, the idea for it was generated from the civil unrest of 2020, the social unrest, and about creating a space where people of color, particularly young folks and their families, can come to receive culturally responsive services that are trauma-informed, that are recovery-focused, that are peer-led. And there's a lot of community support around this idea. So even if we don't get the SAMHSA grant, we are planning to pursue other mechanisms to make this happen, because we think it's a good idea and lots of other people think it's a good idea too. So we are working on it. And any of you, if you work with organizations that would like to be a part of, find out more about it, you can email me or Roz. And I think we are at the place where we can take some questions. Roz, you ready to take some questions?
I am.
Okay, who's got some questions?
I saw a comment from Terusa that I just thought was very interesting, and it's a perspective that I've heard before. And so if I don't know if we can unmute Terusa and let her speak.
Let me.
I would love to hear from Terusa.
Let me get her.
And Jessica, I see your question. How do you start a dialogue with community leaders who are predominantly white in an openly racial rural community? So we'll come back around to that.
All right, Teresa.
Okay, you guys can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, let me just tell you, this is a great presentation, and thank you guys for even bringing this to the forefront. I truly appreciate that. But you know, I am dealing with and being exposed to conversations with some young people who are not buying into the inclusion model anymore, right? And so they're feeling like it's not about not trying to heal, but we heal different. When we talk about intersectionality and how things intersect, I think as Black people or people of color, it shouldn't be our responsibility to try to eradicate or change racism because we didn't implement it, right? But I come across some brilliant presentations with my Caucasian constituents and brothers and sisters who definitely have some powerful, powerful presentation, but it was always being presented in an African-American environment. And I said, why don't you present that to your people, right? Like, we know this. When are you going to gather your people and present this information to them and let us find a way to heal the way we need to heal culturally as a community?
I think, thank you, Teresa. Thank you. And I do think that, you know, having spaces, and I think this is some of what Kareem was referring to or alluding to, having places, you know, where Black people can be together to heal and to talk about, you know, some of the things that are specific, some of the ills that we experience, you know, as a result of just being Black in America, certainly. And just, I my experience and what I've seen, and I see it happen even, you know, in the behavioral health community, is that, like, whoever has power, they have to be held accountable, because otherwise, you know, what benefit is it for them, you know, in a general kind of sense. So I think about how much work has been done, for example, to take away voting rights. You know, now we had John Lewis, Across the Bridge, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and there's work that's actively being done to undo that, you know, and to disenfranchise people. And if we don't say, hey, you know, and believe me, you know, I understand the benefit of allies, and, you know, every movement has to have allies, you know, and thankfully, you know, progress, that's the way progress is made. But if we don't say, hey, we're not going to stand for this, then, you know, the gains that we have made will slowly be eroded away. And, you know, I see it happening, you know, in the behavioral health community with, you know, the state of Georgia being under federal suit, you know, the DOJ suit that happened because of our, you know, being 50th in the country and how we deal with people with mental health concerns. And now that we're coming out from up under that settlement, some of the things, you know, that were put in place as a result of that, you know, and the big focus on peer support and mental health and all of that, you know, and moving away from hospitals, some of that stuff is slowly starting to go right back in the other direction. And so we just have to stay vigilant. And even though it shouldn't be our responsibility, if not us, then who?
Jessica, you can speak if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's really, I guess, hit me hard. I'm originally from Orlando. The majority of my family is biracial. It wasn't until I moved to Georgia that I really saw the effects of racism. And now working in the mental health field and in peer support, trying to have those conversations with our community leaders. You know, I live in a very small rural county that is openly racist from what I've experienced. And the majority of our community leaders are white. How do we bring up that conversation of bringing services, because I can tell you, you know, our ARSC is predominantly white. The individuals who do come in are those who are there because of drug court or are part of a program, and they're mandated to, you know, be at you know, some of the meetings. How do we open that up? How do we reach those leaders to help others?
I think there are a number of ways. Creating, you know, having a listening session. The first thing is identifying your allies, you know, and, you know, people who can speak and will be heard and listened to, and, you know, beginning build those connections. Unfortunately, pandemic, but, you know, having town halls has become easier in the pandemic, while also, you know, a little more challenging. Has been, we live in interesting times, but there's opportunity for you right now to begin building relationships around that. I would, you know, as a first step, I would say just going back through the local newspaper, whatever it is, and seeing, because there have been articles about, you know, racism in your community, in whatever the newspaper is or source of media is, over the past few years, and seeing who supports you, seeing who supports your family, and, you know, connecting with them and trying to, you know, create a, what our friend Jeff Breedlove would call a constituency of consequence in your community, you know, around the topic of racism, and, you know, build from there. I think we are running up on time here. I just want to say how much I appreciate you all being here and, you know, spending this time with us, because this work is really important and is to continue on. And Roz, do you want to take us out?
Sure. I just want to thank everyone. This has been good, and obviously the need for these kinds of conversations is great. And so thank you all for participating. It's been enlightening every time we have these conversations. It's enlightening and just, you know, speaks to the need to keep the conversation going. So we appreciate the Georgia Council for inviting us to have this presentation.
And I appreciate y'all being able to do this. I saw somebody in the chat ask if they could get this link. Would it be okay for me to send this PowerPoint to all the individuals who attended today?
Yes.
All right, I'll send it to them. And again, guys, make sure, guys and girls, make sure that you keep track of your CEU trainings throughout the year. Again, you could do that by noting the month, the topic, and the panelists. And today's topic was racism as a barrier to recovery and wellness. The month is February. The panelist was Rosalind Hayes and Chris Johnson. The email information is right there. And I think that's it. Y'all have a great Thursday, and thank y'all again for taking